Hello friends, today we will be doing an oil change on the 6th generation Mitsubishi Mirage. This tutorial covers Mirages made from 2012 to today. Let us start off by talking about how much this oil change is going to cost us to perform. Of course, this price will vary a lot by what type of oil and filter you choose to use. Here I'm using a brand name filter and full synthetic Castrol Edge motor oil. I've worked out the cost per oil change to be about $31. At the dealership, this would cost about $80, so I'm saving about $50 per oil change by doing this myself. I'm going to be using a jack and jack stands to get under the vehicle, but alternatively you could use ramps or just park the vehicle on a curb. So to start off, if you're using jack stands like me, I've included a photo here you can see of where to put your jack stands. Here we can see where you're supposed to jack the vehicle up from. On the front, which is the left side of this diagram, it is the center of the cross member, or some people call it the subframe. Unfortunately, my jack is kind of low budget and I'm unable to reach this cross member as the handle is too short on my jack, so I will be jacking the vehicle up one side at a time. Anytime you are jacking the vehicle up, remember to only do it on a level surface. Also remember to pull up on the e-brake as you saw me do before you begin jacking the vehicle up. If you are jacking the vehicle up one side at a time as you see me doing here, remember to count the number of clicks you pull up the jack stand up by and make sure it's the same on both sides so that the vehicle stays level in the air. Here you can see that I've correctly placed my jack stand in between the two notches, just as the diagram told us to do. Now we're going to give the vehicle a good shake. It's better if it falls off the jack stands now than when we're under the vehicle. In this diagram, the black arrow indicates where the oil drain plug is. That is the drain plug we are now going to remove. Here's a photo I took with an arrow pointing to the oil drain plug. The bolt is 17 millimeters. This photo is taken from the passenger side, directly in front of the oil drain pan, and to the right of it in this photo is the dark black thing is the starter motor. Alright, we're going to now take our 17 millimeter socket with our breaker bar and we're going to break that drain plug loose. Remember to have your pan ready to catch all the oil as it comes out. As you can see here, our oil drain plug crush washer stayed stuck to the drain plug. We're now going to remove it either with our fingers or with a flathead screwdriver. If you don't see it stuck to the oil drain plug, I recommend you look at the pan. Sometimes it can stay stuck to the pan. While we watch the oil drain, I'd like to point out something that I've noticed from doing these oil changes myself. Since the oil drain plug is at the very back corner of the pan, and since we've got only the front of the vehicle jacked up, I think since the vehicle is at a slope, that the oil changes we are doing are more effective than the dealership as it gets the sediment stuck at the bottom of the pan out. I've noticed this because the first oil change I always do has more metal shavings come out than any of the other ones I do. I think it's because the dealer always jacks the vehicle up level. Now that the oil is done draining, we can take our drain plug, we can put on our new crush washer onto that drain plug, and we can start screwing it in by hand. Now we can get the oil pan out of the way and we can start torquing this down. While you watch me torque this down, I'd like to mention this is a real pain in the ass angle to hold a torque wrench. My arms are fully extended and I'm holding the wrench mid-air. I'd like to mention that even torqued correctly, if you try to reuse the crush washer, it may have a small drip, and what people will sometimes do is they'll try to go back and tighten it some more, because if you then later decide to change the crush washer, you can't, because that would require you to drain out all the new oil you just poured in. If you are considering over tightening the oil drain plug and you end up stripping the threads, do remember that a new oil drain pan is available for the low price of $220 Canadian. Now that you've seen me struggle removing and reinstalling the oil drain plug on the vehicle, I'd like to briefly mention that an alternative does exist. You can replace that drain plug with a valve. The one shown here is a Fumoto valve, which is very popular. It would allow you to drain the oil with no tools. The other benefit with a valve like this is that since I'd no longer need to be able to use a wrench under the vehicle, I could probably change the oil without jacking the vehicle up. Here you can see a different style of oil drain valve on the Mitsubishi Mirage. Here they're using an adapter to attach a plastic hose so you can drain directly into a container, skipping the need for an oil drain pan. Now that we're done our work underneath the vehicle, we can pop the hood. There's a lever near the driver's left foot. Once you pull that, there's a secondary lever that you pull from the outside. You see me doing here near the Mitsubishi logo. There's a tab you push to the left, then the hood will come up and you can use the prop to support it. First thing we're going to do is to remove the old oil filter. You have different options for what tools you want to use. First and foremost, you could theoretically maybe do it with your bare hand, but I'd recommend having a tool ready in case you need it. The one I will be using is the one shown here. It's the oil filter pliers. Alternatively, you could use a strap wrench like this where the rubber part wraps around the filter and the handle is used to twist it. Or you could use the more expensive oil filter size specific sockets with a breaker bar attached to the end. Our first order of business is to locate the oil filter. So looking at the vehicle from the front, it is directly below the air intake manifold and directly behind this lower coolant hose. My oil filter is black, but yours may be any color. Here's a good look at our oil filter. You see those colored wires right there I'm playing with my fingers? I'd like to mention that if you're using oil filter pliers like me and you end up tearing those wires, they go to the oil filter pressure sensor. I can't imagine how difficult soldering wires in that location back together would be. As you can see here, the oil filter pliers have very sharp teeth. It's not uncommon for them to puncture the can. That is why if you start removing this oil filter and you can't, for whatever reason you want to give up, you should not try to start the vehicle again. It is quite possible that the oil filter will leak. Right as I get this filter off, you can see a large amount of oil will come out. That is a sign that we are using a high quality oil filter, as the anti-drain back valve of this oil filter was retaining all that oil. Now that the oil filter is out, you can kind of see there's this small spout looking thing directly below the oil filter to guide the oil away from the engine. I'm going to use some paper towel to wipe down that weird spout looking thing and the mating surface for the oil filter. Particularly, I'm going to pay attention to where the O-ring of the oil filter meets the engine block. That's that smooth round outer ring. I'm doing this because otherwise I may be led to believe that the vehicle is leaking oil as this slowly begins to drip on the ground where I park. Now we are going to take some new fresh oil and use it to lubricate the O-ring of our new oil filter. Now we're going to go put on our new oil filter. I'd like to mention that although you see me putting on and removing these oil filters from the top, you can also access this oil filter from the bottom of the engine to do whatever's more convenient for you. You should never use any type of tool to install an oil filter. They should only be installed by hand. As you can see here, once I feel the oil filter gasket touching the engine block, I back it off a little bit just to figure out exactly where it was touching, take a good look at the logo, and then I will begin tightening this oil filter down. You want to do about 3/4 to 1 turn past the point where you felt that the oil filter gasket was making contact with the engine block. So you can see here I need a piece of paper towel to get it that far as the oil filter is kind of slippery. Now we're going to go under the vehicle and wipe down some of the mess we made. So you can see I didn't position the pan correctly to catch a lot of the oil that came out when the oil filter was removed. So you can see wipe around the drain plug. We're going to wipe the dark black thing, which is the skid plate for the starter motor. It protects the starter motor from impact. If we look up, you can see the oil filter with the funny spout I was talking about. It's basically pointless. So make sure you wipe both sides of this skid plate. Now we're going to remove the oil filler cap and add in our engine oil. As you can see here, I'm going to use a measuring cup and add in 3.2 liters of motor oil. If you're using a larger or smaller oil filter than me, you may need to change the amount of oil you want to add in. It's important to note that since the vehicle is at an angle and we're still on the jack stand, you cannot use the dipstick, as the dipstick is highly inaccurate when the vehicle is not level, as all the oil will move towards one side of the pan. If you're wondering why I use a measuring cup, it's because I have a hard time reading the gauge on the side of the oil bottle. Now we're going to hop in the car and start it up. But before we do that, I'd like to show you something. If we put the key in the run position with the engine off, you can see I've drawn an arrow right here to this red light that looks like a gravy boat. That's the low oil pressure light. So red lights mean you should stop the car immediately. You should not drive the car with low oil pressure. And if you were to damage those wires I showed you earlier for the oil pressure sensor, that would affect the functionality of this light. Since we only used high quality oil filters in this car with an anti-drain back valve, and since we've now drained all that oil out of the filter and the system, when we turn on the car, you will see that this light will stay on for a couple of seconds while the vehicle builds up oil pressure. After we run the car for a little bit and we observe the oil pressure light turn off, we're going to take a quick look under the vehicle. If it's not leaking oil, then we're going to lower the vehicle back onto the ground. Now that our vehicle's back on the ground, if it's on a flat level surface, we can try and check the oil level using the dipstick. We're going to start off by pulling out the dipstick, wiping it clean, then reinserting it. The reason we do this is because while the engine runs, it splashes oil all around in the pan, which could give us an incorrectly high reading on the dipstick. Remember that new oil is very runny. As we pull this out to check the oil level, if you hold it at a weird angle downward or upward, the oil will run down the dipstick and give you an incorrect reading. Unfortunately, I couldn't figure out how to get the oil level to show on the camera, but the way this dipstick works is that there's two holes. One represents high and one represents low. Your goal is to keep the oil level in between these two holes. Between these two holes is roughly a half liter of oil. So if your oil level is currently roughly in the middle of these two holes, you would want to add roughly a quarter liter of oil. And if your oil level was like at the low hole, you'd add roughly a half liter of oil. The reason that this dipstick has a range of acceptable levels of oil and other dipsticks like the transmission one have an exact level of oil you must add is because engines consume oil over time. If you have a very old engine or just certain shitty engines, you're supposed to actually check the oil level at every time you add gas in this car according to the owner's manual, but no one does that, so just kind of fill it up close to max and hope for the best. If you have trouble reading the dipstick, as I often do, I'm going to show you a neat trick. Just wipe the dipstick clean, put it back in the hole. You're going to find a clean piece of paper towel. Then we're going to take the dipstick out and we're going to press it against this clean piece of paper towel. And then you can hold the dipstick next to where you pressed it against the paper towel, and you can get a good idea of where the level is in your oil pan. For me, you can see it's roughly very close to max, which is good. If you have for whatever reason you end up overfilling the engine with oil, the only easy way to get it out would be to buy a special dipstick pump and pump it out the dipstick tube. The last thing for us to do is to reset the oil change light. The oil change light's that gear looking thing right there. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn the engine off. We're going to quickly scroll to the straight lines. We're going to press and hold, and it will say clear, and that is it. It will reset the service interval, and the light will come on when it's the next time for you to change your oil. For those of you that are curious, here's the official Mitsubishi Mirage service manual for how to perform an engine oil change. Thank you for watching this video. Feel free to leave any questions, comments, concerns you have down below. This is a very small channel. I respond to like 100% of comments.